The morning they released me, nobody was waiting outside those doors. I had known that going in. I had no illusions. My daughter stopped answering my letters somewhere around year 3, and by year 5 I had stopped counting the months between her silences. 62 years old, and I walked out of Haverfield Correctional Facility carrying a canvas bag that held everything I still owned in this world. A change of clothes, a Bible with a cracked spine, $38 in small bills, and a photograph of my granddaughter taken at her second birthday party, the last one I was present for. The photograph was the only thing that still felt real. They had convicted me of killing my son-in-law. 7 years. The judge said it calmly, like he was reading a grocery list. 7 years for the death of a man I had found at the bottom of the stairs in my own house, a man my daughter had loved, a man who had made her cry behind closed doors for 2 years before that night. I had called 911, I had screamed his name, and somehow, by morning, I was the one in handcuffs. My court-appointed attorney was 29 years old and terrified of everything, including me. He told me to plead guilty and take the deal. I didn't. I went to trial and I lost anyway. The bus from Haverfield to Cloverside took 4 hours. I sat in the back and watched the October fields go by, the color of rust and old copper, and I thought about what Harriet, my cellmate in year 2, had told me the day before her own release. She had grabbed my hand and said, "Ruthanne, the first thing you do when you get out is go somewhere that used to matter to you. Somewhere quiet. Let it remind you who you are before all this." I knew exactly where I was going. My husband, Bernard, had been buried at Millstone Grove Cemetery out on Route 9 since 2009, pancreatic cancer. We had 41 years together, and I had missed the last 7 of his anniversary visits because of iron bars and fluorescent lights. I owed him flowers. I owed him an apology for being gone so long, even if none of it was my fault. I transferred buses twice and arrived at Millstone Grove just after 3 in the afternoon. The light was low and gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. I had stopped at a gas station and used $8 to buy a bundle of white carnations wrapped in cellophane. They weren't much. Bernard had always said carnations were underappreciated. The cemetery groundskeeper's shed sat just inside the main gate. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and kind eyes waved me through without a word. I found Bernard's plot in the east section, beneath a red maple that had grown considerably in 7 years. His stone was simple, Bernard Aurelius Kemp, beloved husband and father. The grass around it was tidy. Someone had been here recently. That surprised me. I knelt down and started pulling the few weeds at the base of the stone. I set the carnations in the little metal vase and just stayed there a while, not talking, not crying, just being present. The wind moved through the maple above me and the light kept shifting, and I felt, for the first time in 7 years, like I was somewhere I belonged. That was when I heard the small voice. "Are those for him?" I turned around. Standing about 10 feet behind me was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark curly hair and a gap where his front 2 teeth should have been. He was wearing a red jacket that was slightly too big for him and holding a pine cone in each hand like he'd been collecting them. "Yes," I said, "for my husband." He walked a little closer, studying the stone. "Bernard," he read slowly. "That's an old-fashioned name." "It is," I said. He was an old-fashioned man, in the best way. The boy seemed to consider this seriously. "My grandpa is buried over there." He pointed vaguely toward the north end of the cemetery. "My mom brings me here sometimes. She's in the car. She said I could walk around as long as I didn't bother anybody." "You're not bothering me," I said. And I meant it. There was something about him, the pine cones, the missing teeth, the absolute seriousness with which he conducted himself, that made me feel less alone in a way I hadn't expected. His name was Cody. He'd just turned 8. He told me his grandfather's name was on the stone, but he couldn't always remember it without looking, which he felt bad about, and I told him that was perfectly normal, that sometimes grief makes our minds do strange things to protect us. He looked at me with large brown eyes that suggested he was processing this at a level well beyond 8 years old. "Did you come a long way?" he asked. "I did. How long since you've been here?" 7 years, I said. He whistled, low and genuine. "That's almost my whole life." "It is," I said. He was quiet for a moment, kicking gently at a pile of dead leaves. Then he said, almost casually, like he was mentioning the weather, "Someone came to this grave before. At nighttime, my mom told my uncle about it. She saw them from the parking lot when she came to pick me up from Grandpa's stone. She didn't know who they were." I felt something shift in my chest. When was this? He scrunched up his face. I don't know, maybe last summer or the summer before. She was upset about it. She said they were here for a long time and they had a shovel. I looked at Bernard's grave. The ground looked undisturbed. The grass was even the same shade of green all the way across. But someone had been here, with a shovel. Cody, I said, keeping my voice steady, is your mother still in the parking lot? He nodded. Do you think she'd be willing to talk to me for a few minutes? His mother's name was Lacey. She was in her late 30s, tired around the eyes in the way that said the tiredness went deeper than one night's bad sleep. She rolled down the car window when Cody knocked on it and introduced me, and she looked at me the way people look at strangers who claim to have a reason to be talking to them, cautious, measuring. I told her who I was. I told her my husband was buried here. I told her what Cody had said. Something moved across her face. You're Bernard Kemp's wife? I am. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, get in. It's cold. Her name was Lacey Drummond. Her father was buried 3 rows north of Bernard. She came every 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes brought Cody, sometimes came alone. Last August, she had arrived just after dark to leave flowers on her father's birthday. She preferred coming when it was quiet and had seen 2 men near the east section. She'd watched them from the far end of the parking lot, not wanting to approach, and they had been there for almost 40 minutes. One of them had carried something long over his shoulder. Did you tell anyone? I asked. I told the groundskeeper the next time I came. He said he hadn't seen anything, said it must have been family visiting late. She paused, but the way he said it, I don't know. It didn't sit right with me. He seemed nervous. I thanked her. I wrote down my phone number, the number of the cheap motels I was planning to stay at that night, the only number I had, and I asked her to call me if she remembered anything else. Walking back to Bernard's grave before I left, I stood there a long time. I looked at the grass. I looked at the edges of the stone. I got down on my knees and pressed my palm flat against the earth, the way Bernard used to press his hand to the hood of a car to feel if the engine was warm. The soil near the left edge of the stone gave slightly, just slightly, like it had been disturbed and resettled, like someone had tried very hard to make it look untouched. I slept that night at the Route 9 Budget Inn, in a room that smelled like old carpet and someone else's decisions, and I lay on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and tried to think like a person who had nothing left to lose, because that was exactly what I was. Bernard had been a careful man, an accountant for 34 years, then a bookkeeper for a construction company in his last years before the diagnosis. He had kept everything organized, files, receipts, records. After he died, our daughter Heather had helped me go through his papers. There had been nothing unusual, or so I had thought, but I kept coming back to one thing. 2 weeks before he died, Bernard had called me to the bedroom. He was bedridden by that point, and had pressed my hand and said, Ruthanne, if anything ever goes sideways, look at what's underneath the ordinary. I had thought he was delirious. I had kissed his forehead and told him to rest. What if he hadn't been delirious? I got up at 5 in the morning and took a bus to the county library when it opened, and I spent 3 hours in the digital archive section with the help of a librarian named Nobody I had to ask the name of, because she simply appeared and showed me where everything was. I was looking for anything connected to the construction company where Bernard had worked his last 4 years, Halloran and Pruett Development. I found it in the business section of the County Gazette, dated 8 months before Bernard died, a short article. Halloran and Pruett under investigation for financial irregularities. Company executives deny wrongdoing. Investigation ongoing. I read it 3 times. Then I found the follow-up 6 months later. Investigation closed. Insufficient evidence. Halloran and Pruett settles civil suit for undisclosed sum. And then, 2 months after that, a real estate transaction notice. Halloran and Pruett sells primary holdings. Company dissolved. Vincent Halloran. I wrote that name down on the back of a receipt from the gas station. That was the name on every article. Vincent Halloran, co-founder. No mention of Pruett after the first article. The library had an internet terminal. I searched for Vincent Halloran and came up with a LinkedIn profile, construction executive, now living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and a brief mention in a Phoenix Business Journal about a new development company he had founded there. He had moved to Arizona, right around the time the company dissolved, right around the time Bernard died. I sat very still in the library chair and let myself think the thing I had been circling around since yesterday afternoon at the cemetery. Bernard had known something. Something about Halloran and Pruett, something about the financial irregularities, something about where money had gone. He had worked with those numbers for years, and when he died, whatever he knew had gone with him. Except, what if it hadn't? What if Bernard, careful, methodical, always prepared Bernard, had documented what he knew? What if he had put something somewhere safe? Somewhere that no one would look until the time was right, underneath the ordinary. What if he had put it in his own grave? I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. And if someone had said it to me a week ago, I would have told them to lie down for a while. But I had pressed my hand against that soil. I had felt it give. And I knew my husband. I knew the way he thought. When the company investigation started and Bernard was already sick, already dying, and possibly afraid, what would he have done? He would have made a plan. He would have put things somewhere they would be safe until someone could use them. I went back to Millstone Grove that afternoon and asked the groundskeeper if I could speak with him for a few minutes. His name was Bert. He was the same heavyset man with the gray beard who had waved me through the day before, and up close his eyes were not quite as kind as I had first thought. They were watchful, the kind of eyes that have seen things and decided not to say so. I told him I was Bernard Kemp's wife. I told him I had come back after a long absence. I asked him casually, conversationally, whether there had been any activity near my husband's grave that he had noticed over the years. He said no. He said it too fast. I said someone told me they saw two men here at night last August with a shovel, near the east section. He picked up a rake that didn't need picking up. People come at all hours. Can't account for everybody. Of course, I said. Did anyone ever approach you about accessing a particular plot? For any reason? He kept raking. That would go through the office. I just maintained the grounds. I thanked him and left, but as I was walking back toward the main gate, I turned around and watched him. He had stopped raking. He was standing very still, watching me go, and he had his phone in his hand. I didn't stop walking, but I noted it. That evening, I called my daughter Heather for the first time since my release. She answered on the fourth ring, and the silence after she heard my voice was the longest 3 seconds of my life. "Mom," she finally said. Not a greeting, just the word, flat and complicated. "I need to ask you something about your father's papers," I said. "Something specific." Another silence. "What kind of something?" "When we went through his files after he passed, do you remember if there was anything related to Halloran and Pruett? Anything unusual?" I heard her breathing change. "Why are you asking about that?" "Heather, she stopped. There was a folder. I didn't know what to do with it. It had some documents in it, accounting spreadsheets, photocopies of transfer records, things I didn't understand. I put it in a box with the rest of his work papers. I thought it was I didn't know it meant anything. Where is that box now? In my garage. Mom, what is going on? I'll explain everything. Can I come tomorrow? The drive to Heather's house in my rented car, I had pulled $50 from my remaining cash and borrowed the rest from a woman at the motel who had been kind to me without being asked. Took just over an hour. My daughter opened the door, and we stood there looking at each other on the front porch, and it was awkward and painful and necessary, the way a lot of true things are. She brought the box from the garage. It was a banker's box, dusty, with Bernard's handwriting on the outside. Work H&P Final. We sat at her kitchen table and opened it together. The folder was near the bottom. Inside were 37 pages. Photocopies of internal transfer documents, a private ledger with Bernard's handwriting in the margins, and a signed memo from Vincent Halloran to someone identified only as RP. Almost certainly Randall Pruett, the other co-founder, authorizing the movement of approximately $4 million into a holding account that did not appear in any of the company's official records. My husband had known exactly what was happening. He had copied everything, and he had signed and dated each copy in his own hand, along with a handwritten cover note that read, "In the event this matters to anyone who comes looking, I want the truth to have a witness. BAK. I put my hand over my mouth. Heather put her hand over mine. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew." The question now was why someone had come to his grave with a shovel, which meant they also knew, or suspected, that Bernard had documented what he'd seen. And they had been looking for the physical originals, not knowing he'd already made copies and left them with the only person who would keep them without understanding why, his wife, tucked into an unmarked box in his daughter's garage. But who had told them to look? Who had known Bernard well enough to suspect he would do something like this? I thought about that for 2 days. I stayed at Heather's house, sleeping in the guest room, and we talked more in those 2 days than we had in the 7 years before my conviction combined. She cried. I cried. We didn't fix everything. You don't fix 7 years in 2 days, but we started to see each other again, which was enough for now. On the third morning, I was drinking coffee at her kitchen table when something occurred to me. The investigation into Halloran and Pruitt had been closed for insufficient evidence, but somebody had tipped off the investigators in the first place. A company doesn't get investigated out of nowhere. Someone had made a call, filed a complaint, said something. I went back to the library and dug deeper into the archive. 3 days before the investigation was announced, there was a small notice in the business section. Former employee files complaint with State Contractor Review Board. Name withheld pending review. I cross-referenced the dates. Bernard had still been working at Halloran and Pruitt at that point. He had been sick, but he was still going in part-time. Bernard had filed the complaint, and then he died, and the investigation collapsed. And Halloran moved to Arizona, and somebody had spent the years since then wondering if Bernard had left something behind. I needed to talk to someone who knew Halloran directly, not a librarian, not an archivist, someone who had been in those rooms, who had watched what happened up close. I found one through Heather's neighbor, a retired contractor named Nobody Relevant, who mentioned offhandedly that a woman named Denise, who used to do Halloran's books before the company dissolved, still lived about 20 minutes away and had never really talked about why she'd left. Denise Kaufman. She opened her front door and looked at me with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time and wasn't entirely sure she was glad it had arrived. She let me in. She made coffee. And she talked. She had left Halloran and Pruitt 8 months before it dissolved, she said. She had seen the same things Bernard had seen. The off-book transfers, the inflated contracts, the shell accounts. She had done nothing because she had a son in college and a mother in assisted living, and she had not been brave enough. She had watched Bernard start asking quiet questions and had thought, someone braver than me. After he died, she said, Vincent called me. He said he wanted to know if Bernard had been keeping any personal records. I told him I didn't know. He asked twice. I told him I didn't know. Did he believe you? Probably not. A few months later, I heard through someone else that Vincent had hired a private investigator. Not a real one, somebody connected. I don't know what they found. Did you know they went to Bernard's grave? She looked at her coffee cup. I'd heard something. I didn't know it for a fact. I told myself it couldn't be true. She looked up at me. I'm sorry, for all of it. I told her I wasn't there for apologies. I was there because I needed a witness who could corroborate what was in Bernard's documents. She agreed without hesitating. I think she had been waiting for someone to give her a reason. I went to the state attorney's office the following week with Bernard's folder, with Denise's written statement, and with the name of an attorney, a real one this time, a woman who had made a career of financial fraud cases and did not charge me for the first meeting. Her name was someone I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, and she sat across the desk from me and read Bernard's documents and said, Mrs. Kemp, this is not nothing. It was not nothing. The investigation into Vincent Halloran and his current Arizona enterprises took 11 months. I know because I counted them. I was back in Cloverside by then, renting a small apartment 2 miles from Heather's house, working part-time at the county assessor's office. Clerical work, nothing glamorous, but steady and honest and enough. Heather brought my granddaughter to visit on Sundays. Her name was Polly, and she was 9 years old now, and she sat on my kitchen floor and drew pictures with markers while Heather and I drank tea and slowly, carefully rebuilt the thing between us. The case broke open when investigators in Arizona found the holding account. $4 million moved in 2008, reappearing in 2011 as the seed capital for Halloran's new development company. The paper trail Bernard had documented matched exactly. Randall Pruitt, who had never gone to Arizona, who had stayed right here in Cloverside and lived quietly, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. He confirmed everything. Vincent Halloran was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I heard about it on the radio while I was driving to work. I had to pull over. I sat in a parking lot of a dry cleaner's and cried for about 10 minutes, not the sad kind, but the other kind. The kind that comes after something has been held in the chest for so long that its sudden absence feels almost physical. The private investigator Halloran had hired, the one Denise had heard about, turned out to be a man who had in fact gone to Millstone Grove with an associate the previous August. They had dug carefully along the edge of Bernard's stone, looking for something buried, and found nothing. They had replaced the soil and left. They had come up empty because Bernard had never hidden anything in the ground. He had hidden it in plain sight, in a banker's box labeled with nothing worth noticing, in his daughter's garage. Bernard had always said that the safest hiding place was somewhere nobody would think to look twice. He had been right about that, too. I called Lacey Drummond to tell her what had happened. She cried a little on the phone and said she was glad she had talked to me. I told her I was glad Cody hadn't stayed in the car. He never stays in the car, she said. It drives me crazy. Tell him I said thank you, I said. Tell him he did something important. She said she would. On the first warm day of the following spring, I went back to Millstone Grove. I brought carnations again, white ones, the same as before. The red maple above Bernard's stone had new leaves, that particular green that only exists for about 2 weeks in April before it deepens into summer. The groundskeeper, Bert, was not there. I heard later he had retired in January. I knelt at the stone and I told Bernard what had happened. All of it from the beginning. The bus from Haverfield, the October light, Cody and his pine cones, Lacey Drummond in the parking lot, Denise Kaufman's kitchen, and her coffee and her long overdue courage. The moment in the dry cleaner's parking lot when the radio said Vincent Halloran's name. I told him I understood now what he had meant. Underneath the ordinary. I told him I was sorry it had taken 7 years and 1 wrongful conviction and a gap-toothed 8-year-old for the truth to surface, but that it had surfaced, the way things do when they are true enough and someone is stubborn enough to keep looking. I told him I was going to be all right. The maple moved in the April wind, and the light came through it in pieces, and I stayed there a long time before I stood up and walked back toward the gate. There was a message on my phone when I got to the car. It was from my attorney. The State Victims' Compensation Board had approved my claim. The amount was substantial, not enough to give back 7 years, because nothing is enough for that, but enough to matter, enough to make the next chapter feel possible rather than just survivable. I sat in the car and read the message twice, and then I texted Heather one word, "Good news." She texted back immediately. "Polly wants to know if we can celebrate with pancakes." I texted back, "Tell her yes. Tell her as many pancakes as she wants." And then I started the car and drove toward my daughter's house in the April light, which was gold and new and already beginning to change, the way all light eventually does, the way all things do if you can manage to wait long enough for the turning.